We yawn when someone else yawns because we're socially empathetic, not necessarily tired. Your brain can trick you into thinking you've already accomplished tasks that you've only planned. The doorway effect is when you forget why you walked into a room because you passed through a doorway. We find things funnier when we're with friends due to the social laughter contagion. Déjà vu is your brain mistakenly thinking it's experiencing a new situation. Your brain can't tell the difference between a real smile and a fake one. Hindsight bias makes us believe we knew all along what we actually only realized later. Humans are more likely to take risks after smelling the scent of freshly baked cookies. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is when you notice something everywhere after just learning about it. Choice overload can make picking from too many options stressful instead of enjoyable. We have a negativity bias, remembering negative events more vividly than positive ones. Your brain can create false memories, making you believe things that never happened. People are more likely to agree to a request if you start with a smaller one they'll say yes to. Seeing a familiar face in a crowd is the illusory conjunction of features in your brain. We find symmetrical faces more attractive because they're easier for our brains to process. Sensory adaptation makes us ignore constant stimuli like background noises. We laugh even when we don't understand a joke because of social pressure to fit in. Phantom vibration syndrome is when you think your phone is vibrating, but it's not. The mere exposure effect makes us like things more the more we're exposed to them. Earworms are those songs that get stuck in your head for no apparent reason. We're more likely to remember incomplete tasks than completed ones due to the Zeigarnik effect. Digital amnesia is when we rely on our devices to remember information for us. We're better at multitasking than we think, but still not great at it. Seeing someone else scratch can make you feel itchy, thanks to mirror neurons. These neurons were first discovered in monkey's brain. Our brains can interpret unfamiliar symbols as faces, known as pareidolia. Post-purchase rationalization is when we convince ourselves we made a good choice after buying something. We find things funnier when we're tired because our inhibitions are lower. We're more likely to remember things at the beginning and end of a list, the serial position effect. Social media gives us online disinhibition, making us behave differently than in person. Nomophobia is the fear of being without your phone, affecting many of us. Our brains make up stories while we sleep, known as dreaming. Chameleon effect is when we unconsciously mimic the gestures and expressions of others. Out of sight, out of mind happens because our brain's attention shifts elsewhere. We're more likely to remember information if we believe we'll need it in the future. Your brain releases dopamine when you accomplish small tasks, creating motivation. Confirmation bias makes us seek out information that supports our existing beliefs. We're more likely to remember emotional events due to the amygdala's involvement. Semantic satiation is when a word repeated becomes unfamiliar and loses meaning. We're naturally more attracted to people who laugh easily and often. Post-traumatic growth can lead to positive changes after experiencing trauma. We tend to remember events from our teens and early 20s the most vividly. The spotlight effect makes us believe others notice us more than they actually do. We enjoy solving puzzles and problems because our brains release dopamine as a reward. We find jokes funnier when we think they're coming from someone attractive. McGurk effect is when what you see influences what you hear. Our brains tend to remember things that evoke strong emotions, positive or negative. We're more likely to remember faces than names because faces are processed differently. Seeing a loved one's face reduces physical pain, thanks to brain processing. We find people more attractive if we think they like us, known as reciprocity of attraction. Our brains can't resist finishing a pattern even if it's incomplete, the closure principle. We find the sound of our own name more attention-grabbing than other words. Parallel processing allows our brains to handle multiple tasks simultaneously. Our brains create mental shortcuts to process information quickly. We pay more attention to negative feedback than positive feedback. We're more likely to remember something if we laugh while learning it. Peak-end rule means we remember the peak and end of an experience more than the duration. People can subconsciously mimic accents when talking to someone with a different accent. The illusion of transparency makes us believe others can read our emotions easily. We're more likely to follow someone's gaze if they're looking in a specific direction. Our brains are wired to find faces, even in random patterns like clouds or toast. Serial monogamy is when people have a series of long-term relationships instead of one lifelong partnership. We're more likely to trust people who speak and act similarly to us. Fear of missing out, FOMO, drives us to keep up with what others are doing. Our brains can't effectively multitask when it comes to complex cognitive tasks. We tend to remember false information if it's repeated often enough, known as the illusory truth effect. We're more likely to laugh at a joke if we think others around us are laughing. Escalation of commitment is when we invest more in something failing to justify past investments. Our brains predict and prepare for familiar sounds before we actually hear them. Shared information bias is when groups focus on what everyone knows, ignoring unique information. We're more likely to remember unfinished stories, creating a sense of curiosity. Our brains process information more deeply when we have to teach it to someone else. Choice supportive bias makes us believe our choices are better than they actually were. We're more likely to remember emotionally charged events, even if they're insignificant. Our brains can feel physical pain when socially rejected, thanks to shared neural pathways. The misattribution of arousal makes us confuse adrenaline with romantic attraction. We find things funnier when we're in a good mood due to a cognitive bias. Our brains process negative information more thoroughly than positive information. The anchoring effect means our decisions are influenced by the first piece of information we receive. We're more likely to remember vivid dreams and nightmares than mundane dreams. Our brains perceive faces as more attractive if they're symmetrical. Choice paralysis happens when too many choices lead to no choice being made. We find people more attractive when we're in a scary situation, known as the bridge effect. Our brains release oxytocin when we bond with others, creating social connections. Spacing effect means we remember information better when it's learned over time. We find people with familiar names more trustworthy, known as the name-letter effect. Our brains can suppress painful memories to protect our mental well-being. Emotional contagion makes us mimic the emotions of those around us. We're more likely to remember information we actively engage with, like through discussions or teaching. The endowment effect makes us value things more simply because we own them. We find jokes funnier when we believe they're spontaneous rather than rehearsed. Reactance is when we're more drawn to something just because we're told we can't have it. Our brains can't help but assign personalities and emotions to inanimate objects. We're more likely to remember experiences that were interrupted or left incomplete. Semmelweis reflex is the tendency to reject new evidence or new knowledge that contradicts established beliefs. We enjoy being scared by horror movies because it's a controlled way to experience fear. Our brains often overestimate how much we can accomplish in a short period, known as the planning fallacy. We tend to remember the beginning and end of a conversation more than the middle.